Back when I was first getting into the audiophile hobby, the biggest brands around in terms of IEMs were brands like Shure and Westone. But over the years, and with the flood of various Chinese brands in particular coming onto the market with all of their IEM offerings, I'd kind of lost touch with Westone, as I'm guessing many of you will have too, if you've even heard of them, because many people probably won't have heard of them due to that flood of all the different brands available. And so when Westone reached out and asked if I wanted to try out their Mark 70 IEM, I was very curious to see if they were still producing relevant IEMs, or if they'd kind of been left behind by all the new players on the market. The Westone Mark 70s come in at a price of $980 US, making them a premium IEM. And for your $980 US, what you're getting is a pair of IEMs with 7 balanced armatures per side. That's what the 70 in the Mark 70 is about, 7 being the number of balanced armatures. And they come with specifications of 42 ohms of impedance and 110 decibels per milliwatt of sensitivity. So they're going to be very easy to drive from pretty much any device. They're actually going to reveal hiss from devices too, so do be aware of that. And although I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the accessories and the design of them, I do think it's important to talk about briefly for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that if you buy yourself a set of these, you're getting a really chunky, high-quality carry case with them. Westone come very much from the pro side of audio, for stage monitors, for musicians, etc. And so what you're going to get is this hard case, this Pelican case, that's going to fit not just the IEMs, but also a range of tips, your cleaning tool, etc. It does mean that it's quite a chunky case to carry these around in, but it's going to protect them for you as well. The tips you get with the Mark 70s are excellent, and it's a good thing too, because the nozzles that they use are very much like the nozzles on Shure IEMs, in the sense that they're a very thin and narrow nozzle. And so many people, if you've got a collection of tips, you're going to have tips that don't fit on here. But the good news is the Westone tips are excellent, both the foam and the silicon. And so you get a nice range of silicon and foam tips in the box with the Mark 70s. And also this cable, which you might be looking at on the video and thinking it looks thin and a bit crappy, but actually it's a really high quality cable that's deliberately kept thin because it's better for stage musicians, monitoring, etc. And it also happens to be excellent for listening as well. Very comfortable, excellent ergonomically speaking. And it uses these new connectors that are an evolution of MMCX connectors. To me, they look and feel a little bit flimsy at first, but most people I talk to really love them. This is my first experience with them, so I'm going to withhold judgment till I've used them for a bit longer. The final thing, and probably the most important thing to point out about these, is that much like the other brands using this sort of shape and nozzle size, that being Shure, Audiofly, while Audiofly existed, etc., these are an incredibly comfortable IEM. They sit really snugly in the concha of the ear, and the nozzle is going to disappear into your ear canal because it is so narrow, and if you choose the right size tip, you're really not going to know you're wearing them after a few minutes. And so accessories, comfort, and design are all excellent, which leads us to the question of how do they sound? At $980, you'd hope they sound excellent, and the good news is they do. All of my listening for this test, both for the general notes and also the comparisons, it was all completed with the Chord Mojo 2, streaming from the Chord Poly, and my first real listening experience with these was laying in bed listening to the Joss Stone album Never Forget My Love, and it was absolutely magnificent. The sound from the Mark 70s is undeniably smooth, a little bit rich, but the great thing about them is they've got plenty of detail, resolution, and fantastic imaging and staging within an overall smooth sound. Listening to the Never Forget My Love album that I mentioned before, there's a bunch of different solos from trumpets and saxophones, I think. There's obviously vocals from Joss Stone. And throughout the track, each of those sorts of solos occupies a very distinct point in space. And they all sound super natural as well, this being from the Mark 70s. It's probably worth noting at this point, though, that if you've come from some of the more trendy tuned IEMs, as in those that are hunting for accuracy to the Harman target or some other current trendy target, the Mark 70s are not going to sound like those IEMs, and I think they're great because of it. If you come from one of those trendy tuned IEMs to the Mark 70s, your first reaction is going to be that they sound a bit thick, a little bit smooth, perhaps a little bit rolled off. But the Mark 70 is one of those that I would encourage people to give a little bit of time to. Let your brain adjust to it just a little bit. Because as I spent longer and longer with them, having come in thinking they were maybe going to be a bit rich and warm, which I enjoy, but also thinking that a lot of others wouldn't, the more time I spent with them, the more I realized that they're not actually an overly thick sound. They're just different to what I'm really used to. They're different to what I hear day in and day out reviewing a bunch of other products. And yet as I listened more and more, everything, and I mean everything, was there. Detail and resolution were there, staging was there, tonal accuracy from bass through to treble were all excellent. And what I mean by tonal accuracy here is the transition from the bass into the mids, into the upper mids, into the treble. All of that was smooth enough that nothing sounded off. And that to me tends to be more important. It's often less about where exactly there is emphasis, so much as how the emphasis is transitioned within the tuning of the earphone. Where there are transitions in frequency response that are a sudden peak or trough, they tend to stand out to our ears as being unnatural and disconnected from the rest of the music. Whereas the way it's done in the Mark 70 is nothing short of brilliant in my opinion. Everything just sounds right, and everything is allowing you to have maximum musical enjoyment without distracting you with uneven tuning or a specific point of emphasis that makes you hear a detail over and above everything else in the mix. Now, this doesn't mean that necessarily these are the perfect IEM for everybody, but if you want a sound that is just enjoyable, that's just natural and fun and easy to engage with, that's when the Mark 70s are brilliant, and you're not trading off things like detail and nuance to get that tuning. It is worth mentioning that the bass from these is not super snappy like some balanced armatures, and it's not super punchy like some dynamic drivers can do. It's a smoother, slightly slower bass, but it's not flabby or woolly. It's just a little bit slower. It's not quite as I said, tight, punchy or snappy as some might want. That is worth recognizing about these. On the other hand, the bass is full, it's present, it's not boomy, but it's got all the bass you need for any type of genre I've tried them with. And I wanted to include here one of the tracks that I was listening to just as I made my general notes across a whole wide range of tracks. One track that came on was I'm Confessin' by Dr. John. And the reason I wanted to highlight this was that this is a track that relies on a lighter tuning. You don't need a lot of bass with this. You don't need a very warm tuned IEM with this. But what you do want is detail, resolution, and articulation. And the reason I wanted to point this out is that despite being a warmer, smoother IEM, the Mark 70s don't lose out on any of those things like resolution and texture and nuance. And specifically on a track like this, the guitars have this wonderful sense of articulation and clarity from the Mark 70s. But what they're also delivering is the resonance, the harmonics of the guitar body. The separation of all the sounds is fantastic, with Dr. John's vocal out front and closest to you as a listener, but all still very coherent in a wonderfully shaped soundstage. The piano is tactile and again has that sense of resonance and body and weight that a piano should have. And what I mean by tactile is that you can feel the energy of the hammers of the piano hitting the strings as Dr. John plays the keys. So you're not losing out on that energy, that detail, and that texture. It's just being delivered in a package that's very engaging. There's also some brushed drums in this track, so where they're playing with the brushes instead of sticks on the drums. And that brings a sense of texture that, again, the Mark 70s deliver. They're not smoothing off detail and texture like this. They're just not pushing it forward and enhancing it in the way that a lot of other IEMs that I've tried recently, they do tend to do. And so for me, the Mark 70 was stacking up to be a very, very enjoyable IEM. It actually reminds me of one of my all-time favorite IEMs in the audiophile AF1120. That's no longer available now. And the AF1120 did have a few shortcomings. I think the Mark 70 does a better job than even the AF1120. But the reason I like both of them is that they deliver a sound that is incredibly easy just to lose yourself in. And that for me is what it's all about. I don't look to my devices, my audio devices, as technical tools to pull apart the sound, to pull apart the mix. I of course want detail, resolution, and clarity, but I want it delivered in the context of the overall musical experience. And that's where the Mark 70s are absolutely brilliant to me. And so I think now is probably a good time to jump into some comparisons. And I looked through my collection and I found two IEMs that I think make for an interesting comparison. One of them is the Beyerdynamic Xelento 2, and the reason I chose that is because it's a richer, warmer sounding IEM that's also excellent. And then the second comparison I wanted to talk about is the Thieaudio Monarch Mk3, which is another IEM that's priced about the same as the Mark 70 and one that many of you might have heard and therefore be able to use as a reference point. Starting off with the Beyerdynamic Xelento 2 and listening to a bunch of tracks, but I stopped to make my notes on Bad Woman Blues by Beth Hart. Kicking off with the Xelento 2, and the sound is full and punchy from those. If you've heard those, you'll know exactly what I mean. The Xelento 2 presents a fun, but definitely V-shaped sound, but the good news is that they balance the vocals very, very well. So you've still got a sense of presence and focus in the vocals. It's not lost in the background, but it is a V-shaped tuning overall. Moving over to the Mach 70s, and as I've already alluded to, you do miss out on some of the punch from the bass. The Xelento 2 hits a bit harder, but you don't lose overall bass quantity, just the impact of it. And I think that's going to come down largely to the differences between how a balanced armature can deliver bass and how a dynamic driver can deliver bass. And I'm not going to say one's better or worse, they're just different. Where I think the Mach 70 is better though, is that it does start to balance out frequencies just a little bit better than the Xelento 2. It's less V-shaped, and therefore everything sounds more naturally placed in the mix. As this track got a bit busier, one of the areas that I found the Mach 70s pulling ahead of the Xelento 2 was that they're able to resolve details and separate the vocal just a little bit more as things got really busy. Occasionally I would find the lyrics getting a little bit lost on the Xelento 2, but the Mach 70 I was always able to hold on to them with. Thinking about staging on these, and both of them are fantastic for staging, but they're also a little bit different. The Xelento 2 delivers a stage that's a little bit narrower and a little bit deeper, whereas on the Mach 70 things go a bit wider, but the maximum depth is probably reduced just a little bit. As to which is better, I don't think I could say. They're both very enjoyable, and if you're not comparing between the two, both are fantastic in the sense that you can close your eyes and just wander around the soundstage. And so having compared both at length, I think if you want a pure fun IEM, the Xelento 2 is a wonderful, wonderful choice. But if you want an IEM that's balancing a natural tonal balance with a sense of fun and engagement and enjoyment, I think the Mach 70 has the better balance. It leans less into that V-shaped fun and more into a smooth transition from bass through mids through treble. And so both are excellent, but if you were to put both in front of me, it's the Mach 70 I'd reach for. And with that in mind, let's turn our attention now to the Thieaudio Monarch Mk3. I mixed things up here, listened to some different tracks, and ended up making my notes on Walk Back In by Kev Mo. And the first thing I noticed about the Monarch Mk3 was that the separation from it was almost a little bit too extreme. Sometimes it's hard to know if this is in the mix or if this is a trait of the IEM, but I felt like the Monarch Mk3 was pulling sounds apart too much. Sounds like the snare in this track was just a little bit too evident and a little bit too focused in the mix, so they didn't blend in with everything else as much as I think they should. Having said that, the quality of Kev Mo's vocals from the Monarch Mk3 was excellent. The tonality was natural, the image was beautifully focused, but still connected to the rest of the music. But as I listened more and more, the rhythm guitars and the lead guitar were again a little bit pulled apart from the mix, like they were being overly separated. And in my experience, that's often due to some slightly lumpy or peaky tuning of the headphones, or earphones in this case. The bass from the Monarch Mk3 is tactile and solid, but I would describe it as a little bit secondary to the other frequencies in the mix. So what I mean by that is that I feel like there should be just a little bit more bass than what we're getting to balance out the bass with the mids and the treble energy that we're getting. That again is one of those personal things that's going to vary based on your ear canals, the tips you're using, the insertion depth. But for me, with my ears and my perception, the Monarch Mk3 just falls a little tiny bit short on bass. When I swapped over then to the Mach 70, it was a massive, massive tonal shift. And this is what I spoke about before. The Monarch Mk3 is what I would call a more trendy tuning. And I don't mean trendy as a knock. Obviously, trends happen because people like them. But at the same time, I feel like sometimes it does a disservice to the ability for us to enjoy a wide range of different sounds. And the Mach 70 from Westone is a clear departure from the trend, and one that I love, but it does initially, coming from the Monarch Mk3, the Mach 70 does initially come across as quite warm and a little bit muted at first. Going back to the beginning of the track, and I noticed that the snare that I talked about before is still quite separated in the mix. So obviously the way this mix has been done, it does kind of highlight and separate the snare out, but it's a little bit less obvious from the Mach 70 and therefore a little bit more coherent. This could be one of those cases where the track and the IEMs are kind of creating a synergy for better or worse with each other. And in my case, I think the Mach 70 is the better combination. Focusing in on the vocals, I think the Mach 70 does a better job with the vocals. It has more body and weight down low, which I think on a male vocal it should. And the guitars are once again a bit more connected to the overall mix. They still kind of pop out of nowhere, and I'm pretty sure that's to do with how it's been mixed, but it's less disconnected, it's more coherent with the Mach 70. And so at this point, on this particular track, it was very hard for me to say which of these was the better IEM. I think both were excellent, I was enjoying both, but I really needed to listen to a whole bunch of different tracks to get my head straight on which of these IEMs I preferred. And as I listened across a wide range of genres, different tracks, different qualities of recordings, what I found was that the Monarch Mk3's treble and upper mids could often get quite uncomfortable, a little bit fatiguing, a little bit too kind of enhanced, and therefore slightly unnatural. Whereas across the board, without fail, the Westone Mach 70 was consistently enjoyable. It was a sound that I could absolutely guarantee to enjoy everything through. And in fact, so much so that I've recently set up my Squiglink site where you can check out all the different measurements of the IEMs that I've got here, that I've reviewed in the past, and that I'm reviewing coming up. And as part of that process, I wanted to set up a preference curve or a target curve for me. Not to say that it's right, but to give you an idea of what sound I enjoy, the ideal shape of a measurement for my ears and my tastes. And the reason that I'm talking about this is that the shape, the starting shape that I'm working with, and this is not final yet at the time I'm recording this, but the shape that I'm working with at the time I'm recording this is actually based on the Mach 70 tuning. I've tweaked it a little bit to pull out some of the upper bass and also to get a little bit more energy through some of the upper mids, just a little bit more than what the Mach 70 has. But the point is, they are so close to what I think is an ideal tuning for an IEM that those were my starting point to work from. They came the closest of any IEM that I had in my collection, short of the Fur Audio Radon 6, but they're a custom and I can't use those because I can't measure them on the coupler properly. And so the reason that I say all that is to illustrate the fact that to me and my ears, I think the Westone Mach 70 is an absolutely fantastic IEM. I actually think it's a shame that Westone don't get more publicity in this space. Obviously their pro business is probably going strong and that's great, but with all the talk that we have in this hobby about the thousands and thousands of models coming out of China in most cases, I think it's definitely worth giving some love to somebody like Westone who continue to make, based on the Mach 70 at least, really top tier IEMs. They're supremely comfortable, they're well made, they've got great accessories, and they sound fantastic. So if you're looking for something a bit different, if you want to start drifting away from the trendy tunings of late and you're looking for a great performer that's going to be enjoyable on everything, then I do recommend checking out the Westone Mach 70. If anyone wants to ask me in the future what my favorite and most recommended universal wide IEM would be, the Mach 70 is going to be top of my list. I think it's absolutely a brilliant IEM. And so I will hunt around and try to find some links to put down below. At this stage, I don't know that they will be, but if they're through to Amazon, they are affiliate links. And thank you for any and all support from those of you that buy with those links. But for now, I'm going to wrap this up by saying that the Mach 70s are nothing short of brilliant. And I hope that this video has been helpful, useful, or informative in bringing them to your attention. If you have liked the video, please hit the like button. And of course, subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.